They grew up with no seatbelts, no helmets, no supervision, and they turned out fine. Or did they? Every generation gets a label. Boomers get blamed for everything. Millennials can't stop talking about their trauma. Gen Z is apparently eating laundry pods or redefining gender, pick your headline. But Gen X? Gen X just watched quietly from the back of the room. Unimpressed. And that's actually the most psychologically fascinating thing about them. Born roughly between 1965 and 1980, Generation X is sandwiched between two of the loudest, most talked about generations in history, and they have been completely overlooked because of it. Marketers ignored them. Researchers focused on boomers, then sprinted to millennials. Even the name is telling, X. Unknown. Undefined. A variable. But here's what's wild, that neglect shaped them in ways that are psychologically distinct from every other living generation. And today, we're going to break down exactly what that looks like, the core psychology, the wounds, the strengths, and why understanding Gen X might actually tell us a lot about where all of us are heading. To understand Gen X psychology, you have to start with one word, unsupervised. The 70s and 80s saw a massive spike in divorce rates, dual-income households, and working single parents. These kids came home to empty houses. They made their own snacks, did their own homework, or didn't, watched whatever they wanted on TV, and figured things out alone. Psychologists call this autonomous childhood. And while it sounds almost idyllic in a retro way, the emotional reality was more complicated. Research shows that latchkey kids often developed a deep sense of self-reliance, but paired with an underlying emotional loneliness. They learned early that adults weren't always available. That you couldn't count on institutions. That if something needed doing, you did it yourself. This is where Gen X's famous independence comes from. But it's also where their emotional guardedness comes from. Therapists who work with Gen X clients often note a difficulty asking for help, not because they're too proud, but because they genuinely internalized the belief that help wasn't coming. Gen X came of age during a specific cultural moment. AIDS crisis. Cold War. Crack epidemic. Challenger explosion. Corporate downsizing. And then, the thing that hits different psychologically, they watched their parents' generation build a dream, and then saw that dream not deliver. Boomers were told, work hard, get a house, have a career, retire comfortable. And many of them got exactly that. Gen X watched that deal get quietly cancelled, for them. They graduated into recessions. Saw job security evaporate. Watched institutions fail, the government, the church, the media, the family unit. The psychological response? Cynicism. Not depression exactly. Not nihilism. But a very specific brand of, I'll believe it when I see it. This shows up in their humor, dark, dry, self-aware. Comedy that doesn't believe in heroes. That deflates pomposity. That says, yeah, I see what you're doing, with a raised eyebrow. Psychologists call this ironic detachment, a way of preempting disappointment by never fully investing. And while it looks like coolness on the surface, it can mask a real grief, the grief of a generation that wanted to believe, and got burned for it. Here's where it gets really interesting. Gen X has what researchers call an ambiguous generational identity. They don't have the clear, we changed the world narrative of boomers. They don't have the internet-native collective identity of millennials. They're too young for one story, too old for the other. And psychologically, this creates something fascinating, a generation that is simultaneously individualistic and identity fluid. Gen X grew up with MTV, with punk, with hip-hop, with the emergence of identity politics, but before the internet forced everyone into tribes and labels. They experimented with identity in ways that felt personal, not performative. You liked what you liked. You wore what you wore. And you didn't need validation from a following. Erik Erikson's theory of identity development suggests that adolescence is the critical window for forming a stable sense of self. Gen X navigated that window during extreme cultural upheaval, and many emerged with identities built on values and taste rather than group belonging. That's why you'll meet Gen Zers who are fiercely, almost stubbornly, themselves. They built their identities in a world that wasn't watching. If there's one psychological trait that defines Gen X above all others, it's resilience, but not the inspirational poster kind. It's quiet resilience. The kind built from just getting through things. No therapy. No processing. No wellness retreat. Just, that happened, now what's next? Studies on Gen X adults consistently find high levels of what psychologists call psychological hardiness, the combination of commitment, control, and challenge. They commit to what they care about. They believe they can influence outcomes. And they view adversity as a challenge, not a catastrophe. This is why Gen X, despite being the forgotten generation, quietly ended up running a huge portion of the economy. They didn't demand the spotlight. They just did the work. But there's a shadow side here too. That same hardiness can become emotional suppression. The "I'm fine" reflex. The difficulty naming feelings. The sense that needing support is a weakness. Gen X is the generation most likely to say, "I turned out fine," about a childhood that, by any modern standard, would have therapists raising their eyebrows. And sometimes they're right. And sometimes, they haven't looked closely enough yet. Right now, Gen X is in what might be the most psychologically demanding life stage of any generation currently alive. They're the sandwich generation. Raising their own teenagers and young adults, while simultaneously caring for aging boomer parents. Financially supporting both directions. Emotionally holding multiple households together. And they're doing it with classic Gen X energy, without complaining much. Without making it a whole thing. Without a TikTok series about their struggle. But psychologists are starting to pay attention. Caregiver burnout in Gen X is rising. Rates of anxiety and depression, long suppressed, are surfacing in their 40s and 50s as the armor they built in childhood starts to cost them something. The good news? Gen X also tends to be highly adaptable. They predate the internet and adopted it. They lived analog and went digital. That cognitive flexibility, the ability to hold contradictions, to adapt without identity crisis, is a real psychological asset. So what do we do with all of this? I think the psychology of Gen X is actually a mirror for something universal, the way childhood shapes us in ways we don't always recognize. The way the world we grew up in becomes the invisible water we swim in as adults. The way our greatest strengths and our deepest wounds are often the same thing. Gen X learned independence because no one came home. They learned resilience because the deal fell through. They learned skepticism because they got lied to. And yet, they built careers, raised families, quietly kept institutions running, and created some of the most culturally enduring art, music, and humor of the last 40 years. That's not nothing. That's actually a lot. Maybe the lesson isn't about Gen X at all. Maybe it's this. The generations we call forgotten are often the ones that were forced to become self-sufficient. And self-sufficient people don't need to be remembered. They just get things done. If you're Gen X, this one was for you. You probably didn't ask for it. You definitely don't need the validation. But you deserve it anyway. And if you're not Gen X, now you know why that one coworker, or parent, or manager of yours seems unbothered by everything. They've been practicing since 1978. Drop a comment, what generation are you, and what's one thing this video got right or wrong? I genuinely want to know. And if you want to go deeper on generational psychology, the next video is right there. I'll see you in it.